I finished my commercial pilot's license, and now I'm faced with a decision. Should I go into doing something like flight instructing to build my hours, or should I go into something like flying an air taxi? Let's talk a bit about it. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Late Departure. I am Adam, and as some of you may know, this is my continuing journey to hopefully becoming a commercial airline pilot in the future. And today I'm talking about the difficult decision I was faced with as I have been progressing through my flight training here, which is which direction am I going to go when I want to build hours towards my future hopeful airline pilot career here. And there are two major paths that people take. One of them is just going right out into commercial flying right away, going into something like an air taxi operation or doing survey flying or something like that. And then the other side of it is going to do flight instructor work. So just going out and teaching students, joining a school, making one of the lowest salaries that you can possibly make in any job. But it is another very valid way of, building up your hours and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk a little bit about each, and then we'll talk a little bit about which one I decided upon, which might be new for those of you who haven't been paying attention to my channel, and for those of you who have, probably already know which direction I'm going. But let's start off with the air taxi, or just some of the basic commercial operations out there. Now, one of the things about these positions, like there are lots of things you can potentially do, like crop dusting or survey work or air taxi or all kinds of stuff. Some of the jobs require, for example, with the air taxis, some of them require that you have your IFR rating and things like that, and some of them require things like IATRA. And that's one of the biggest obstacles for a lot of these ops, is that you actually need like your multi-IFR and stuff like that, which I know for a lot of you, you'll probably plan to have anyways, so it's not really a big deal. But for example, for the IATRA, you'll need, I think, 250 hours, which isn't too difficult, especially if you're doing your multi-IFR. It makes sense that you'll probably be, getting up well above 200 hours. I know I'm well above 250 hours already, but in any case, it's just something to consider for, just the basic requirement. And if you're willing to go and get all the extra things like IATRA and whatnot for these types of jobs. But there's two other really big things that are the main concerning items for me for things like air taxi and, a lot of the other small like bush pilot kind of operations out there. The biggest one for me is the safety factor. And from what I've heard from the pilot community, the small bush pilot and air taxi operations are notorious for sending pilots out in unsafe conditions. They often expect pilots to go in really bad weather conditions or unsafe conditions in terms of the weighting of the aircraft and all kinds of stuff. I've heard multiple horror stories from various pilots, even up until today, who have faced this kind of safety concerns. And it just seems like an unnecessary risk for me. However, it is what it is. Like flying in real life, you're going to be faced with some challenges. However, especially with the smaller operations, like there's a really funny video on YouTube, which I might be able to link in the description, about a typical pilot interview, and where this guy talks about, you have to fly smelly drunk people around, and sometimes they're really dangerous operations and stuff like that with very little pay and all that kind of stuff. It's not always true. That's not always the case, but from what I've heard, in a lot of situations, it's quite true. It is quite dangerous, and that is a big factor. That being said, there is the possibility to get quite a lot of hours. You might get up quite regularly. You might be stacking a lot of hours in those operations. And also, you might be able to get some multi-air time if you're put on the legendary Navajo or some other multi-engine aircraft. You can stack up the multi-time, which is really valuable for, any future career in aviation. Because when you get up to the big leagues and flying some of the big jets like the ones behind me here, you're most likely going to be flying multi-engine aircraft. So that's something to consider, that you have those advantages, that you'll be able to, get more hours and you'll get some more multi-time potentially. Not always. You might be in the survey job where you're flying a 172 in slow flight for hours on end over the prairies or something like that. That happens as well, right? But that's just something to consider. However, there is another thing about the air taxi operations which makes them a little undesirable for me, especially, is the ramp time. A lot of the air taxi operations require their workers to work on the ramp. It could be 6 months, it could be like a few years. I've heard from people who have worked anywhere between a couple months on the ramp to many, many years on the ramp. And this is, by the way, not just like on the ramp, like working on the runway at a nice place like this. We're talking about working on the ramp in remote northern regions of Canada where you have limited resources, where you're going to be paid very little. You're going to pay a lot in your living costs, like for your housing and stuff like that. And I've talked with many professional pilots who are currently in this situation, who are struggling in some of these remote communities and working pretty crazy hours and pretty crazy conditions for not very much money. You know, some of them really love it. Some of them are scared for their lives. You know, it's you know, a mixed bag. Some of them are still working on the ramp after all this time in the freezing cold, cleaning oil off aircraft, you know, just doing grunt work at the airport. And, you know, ramp work is hard. I did it for 3 years. It's hard. It can be dangerous. You're outside a lot, you know, in the elements. It can be pouring rain. It can be intensely hot. It can be intensely cold. It can be very rough. And this is one of the big things for me that was just like, you know, I've done my time on the ramp. You know, if you're young and you want to go into that, you know, go for it. But it's just not for me. That's me personally. Again, you can make your decision what'll work best for you. What's best for everyone will be different for everyone. Just keep that in mind. So let's look at the alternative, which is flight instructor. Now, being a flight instructor, first of all, the training for it, you have to go into a separate training program, which costs an additional $10,000 to $15,000. Oh, mandatory plane break. Now, in addition to the cost, it's also a pretty extensive program. You have about 30 hours of flight training. You have a whole ground school to get through, stuff that I'm currently doing right now. Oh, spoiler. And it is a whole thing. And then, of course, with flight instructor, now you have a whole different set of advantages and disadvantages. Now, the biggest advantage for me is the fact that ultimately you decide when you go out, and a lot of flight schools have some pretty reasonable minima. So if it's too cloudy or windy or rainy or something like that, you know, you can make a call and you have the choice to stay safe and, you know, not risk yours and your student's life. You know, I think that's a really, really big plus for me. And for me, as someone who's older, you know, I have a family, I want to take care of my family. That's a really big thing. Now, that is the plus. Unfortunately, flight instructors also have a lot of minuses. And so for one, you can get very limited flying hours depending on the weather, depending on the time of year. You can have crazy students that might try to kill you, something that does happen. So that it does have its own dangers as well in flight instructing. And, you know, you really have to find that balance between, you know, being a flight instructor who lets your student explore the plane and enjoy flying, but also making sure that you don't go past any of your personal limits, because if the plane gets too far out of your limits, it can mean the end of you, right? So it has its own dangers, definitely. The salary is one of the lowest of any job in the world, probably. If you look on Glassdoor, man, we had some students on the Discord saying, oh, but flight instructing, they say on glassdoor.ca that you make $75,000 a year. No, you don't. You absolutely do not. I think what Glassdoor did is they took like the typical flight instructor salary, which can be anywhere between $15 to $40 an hour, and they just multiplied that by like 8 hours a day or something like that. No, that is not the salary of a flight instructor. Flight instructors, if you ask real flight instructors, they're making pennies. They're making barely enough to survive. Unless you become a private flight instructor and you start your own business and stuff like that, which some people do and some people succeed at. I know, you know, some friends who have gone down that path and they love flight instructing. And, you know, flight instructing can be extremely rewarding. but it doesn't pay very much. And that's just really one of the things you have to keep in mind, that you're not going to be paying off your flight training anytime soon if you're doing a flight instructor position. That being said, it is, again, while there is a potential not to get too many hours, there's also, if you go to a busy school as a lot of students, there is a potential to get a lot of hours. And if you play your cards right, you could probably maybe not go toe-to-toe with the bush pilots, but you might be able to get in a pretty reasonable amount of hours on a daily basis, and maybe more safely and more consistently make it towards your goal, whether that be an airline pilot or whatever that might be, right? So they both have their advantages and disadvantages. I chose flight instructor rating because ultimately the safety factor was big for me. And also, another thing I didn't mention was, if you're flying for the air taxi, you might end up in another city or another town many days a week. I'd rather spend a little bit more time with my family while I can. I realize that as an airline pilot, I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time with my family. But I decided that for me, it just made the most sense to do something now that'll let me spend a little bit more time with my family now, and also to kind of keep me in one place where I can focus on my studies, focus on my training and all that kind of stuff. It just worked out better that way. So that is why I took the flight instructor route instead of the air taxi, other commercial operations route. Like I said, you can go either way, and I know lots of people who go both, and some people who say, you know what, I just don't want to teach. I'm not good at teaching. I don't want to subject a student to that. And to those people, I say, great. Like, good on you for noticing that and for doing that, because one of the biggest issues that we have out there are flight instructors. And, while most flight instructors I think are just amazing, they love teaching, they love their jobs, they love flying, there are a small handful that just want to get hours, they don't care about you. There's a really great video that Lou Dix did, maybe I can link it in the description or something like that, and there's one flight instructor there particularly who just wants to get hours, who just wants to get in the airlines, doesn't care about the flight training. And if you're feeling that way, go the air taxi route, go the other way. Don't become a flight instructor, and don't cause your students pain or waste your students' tens of thousands of dollars, not training them properly just because you don't care about teaching or you don't want to be there, right? That's just absolutely terrible. And I think, if you're thinking about that, please don't. Anyways, on that note, I hope that was helpful for most of you. And, as always, thank you all for joining me on my late departure here. If you're out flying, have fun, fly safe, fly your best, enjoy the lovely fun of flight training. And as always, remember, it's never too late. See you next time.